Welcome to the SUNY Potsdam Library's tutorial on primary sources. In this video, we'll define how primary sources differ from secondary sources, and we'll discuss examples of different kinds of primary sources. Primary sources can be considered the raw materials that scholars use for their research. They are original sources, objects, data sets, or writings that date from the time period you're studying and have not been interpreted by anybody else. When you're using primary sources, you're interpreting their meaning yourself without relying upon anything anyone else has written about them. This is the difference between a primary source and a secondary one. Secondary sources are books or articles written by someone else who has done research, examined primary sources, and is expressing their interpretations of them. Most of the nonfiction books we read are secondary sources because they represent someone else's arguments or interpretations of the topics they cover. You may also sometimes hear of tertiary sources. These are books that draw entirely from secondary sources, essentially repackaging their conclusions without doing any primary source research of their own. A textbook is a good example of a tertiary source. So what are some examples of primary sources versus secondary sources? Well, one would be a history book, like Band of Brothers, written by historian Stephen Ambrose. Ambrose did a lot of primary source research himself. He interviewed dozens of veterans of World War II, and then he wrote a narrative of their experiences, making decisions on what quotes to choose, what stories to tell, and what language to use. So Band of Brothers is a secondary source. However, if you find an interview with one of the veterans from Band of Brothers, like this one of Major Dick Winters, that's a primary source, because it's Major Winters explaining his own experiences in his own words without anyone else interpreting them for you. Likewise, if you're taking an English class and studying, say, John Updike, this critical biography of Updike by author Bob Batchelor is a secondary source, because it's Batchelor's interpretation of Updike's career and works, while one of Updike's novels, like his classic Rabbit Run, would be a primary source you could use to examine Updike's writing style, use of language and imagery, and so on. As we'll discuss in a minute, art can be a primary source too. This book about artist Elizabeth Catlett, written by art historian Melanie Herzog, is a secondary source, while Catlett's actual art, such as this woodcut from 1951 called Sharecropper, is a primary source that you might analyze and interpret in an art history class to understand what Catlett was conveying through her art and what techniques she used to create it. First-person accounts of events are probably the most commonly cited and traditional examples of primary sources because they represent an individual's direct account of what they experienced. Journals or diaries, like the Diary of Anne Frank, are invaluable primary sources because they are written as the author is experiencing those events. But an autobiography or memoir, like Frederick Douglass's My Bondage and My Freedom, is a primary source too. Although Douglass wrote it years after some of the events he describes, it still represents his views and account of his life in his own words. Newspaper stories, like this one of the Ogdensburg Journal reporting on the sinking of the Titanic, are also primary sources since they are immediate accounts of events as they occurred. Personal letters, in this case one from Mahatma Gandhi to Adolf Hitler, pleading with Hitler to not start World War II, are potent primary sources, as are speeches, like those delivered by Cesar Chavez when fighting for agricultural workers' rights, and that can be in the form of an audio or video recording, or just a transcript of the speech. Novels, poems, plays, and other forms of literature can be primary sources too, but you just need to be careful with how you're using them. The Iliad, by Homer, written nearly 3,000 years ago, is an account of the Trojan War, while many of Shakespeare's plays, such as Macbeth and Henry V, are about real people. But Shakespeare wrote his plays hundreds of years after those people lived, and he made up the dialogue he has them say, while the Iliad includes mythical gods and heroes. So you wouldn't want to rely on those as historical primary sources for how events actually occurred or what people actually said. However, Shakespeare is essential for understanding English literature, and the Iliad is essential for understanding the development of Greek poetry and mythology, so they're literary primary sources, but not historical ones. As mentioned earlier, original artwork can be a primary source as well. Paintings, like this one by Jean-Michel Basquiat, are primary sources that you might analyze in an art or art history class, as are sculptures, murals, or even videos of dances or performance art. So too are artifacts, like this Egyptian coffin found at the Cleveland Museum of Art, or the Mohawk wolf belt from the Akwesasne Cultural Center. By examining and researching these historical artifacts, archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians can learn about past cultures, how they lived, what their beliefs were, and so forth. Those are what we might consider conventional primary sources, but there are loads of things that can be unconventional ones. Many academic fields have developed to the point where almost anything can be a primary source, depending on how you use it. So let's take a look at a few examples of those. Comic books can be a primary source since they reflect the times in which they were written. This Captain America story from 1974, for instance, was heavily influenced by the Watergate scandal that was going on at the time, as it has a high-ranking government official trying to overthrow the United States and install himself as a dictator. In recent years, social media has also become an invaluable type of primary source. With Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and other forms of social media becoming essential for communication, politicians, activists, and other public figures regularly use this medium to express their views, letting us understand what they're thinking and what policies they're pursuing. And even comedians can serve as primary sources, particularly ones who provide social commentary, like George Carlin or Z-Way, since they can give us insight into what's going on in our culture and society. Music can be a primary source too, because popular songs often let us know how people were experiencing the world when those songs were written and recorded. For instance, protest songs from the Vietnam era, like Universal Soldier by Buffy Sainte-Marie and Ohio by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, tell us how some Americans felt about the Vietnam War. Likewise, we can use Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come and Gil Scott-Heron's The Revolution Will Not Be Televised to trace the evolution of the civil rights movement. And music doesn't have to be overtly political in order to be a primary source. Jumping ahead a few decades, we can analyze Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit and the Smashing Pumpkins' 1979 to understand the alienation and angst felt by Generation X during the 90s. And depending on how we use them, movies are another type of primary source. Movies made during World War II, like Bataan, Mrs. Miniver, and Casablanca, are great examples of propaganda, showing us how Hollywood was trying to influence the American people to support the war effort. A later movie about World War II, though, like Saving Private Ryan, is not a primary source about the war, since it was made more than 50 years later and is a recreation of World War II, rather than something made while the war was going on. If you're looking for a primary source movie on World War II, you want to use Casablanca, not Saving Private Ryan. But it's important to note that later movies can be their own type of primary source. The movie MASH is set during the Korean War. Since it was made in 1970, almost 20 years after the Korean War, it's not a primary source about Korea. But because it was made during the Vietnam War, it's a great primary source for Vietnam, with its hippie doctors fighting against the uptight army establishment. So as we've seen, there's a vast range of things that can be primary sources, and we've only touched the tip of the iceberg with these examples. There are literally dozens of other types of primary sources, including documents from the congressional record, scientific data sets, TV news footage, and magazine advertisements. And as mentioned earlier, it all just depends on how you use something. You don't want to use MASH to tell you what the Korean War was like, or the Iliad to tell you exactly what happened during the Trojan War, but they can be invaluable primary sources for telling about the times in which they were made.